There is a particular cruelty built into the culture of Bay Street. One that has nothing to do with the market and everything to do with the mirror. It does not announce itself. It moves quietly through boardrooms and performance reviews in overlooked resumes and conversations that begin without you. And it delivers its sharpest verdict in the simplest possible way. A woman who takes up too much space in her body will never be allowed to take up space anywhere else. Verity Ashdown had understood this early. She was 29 years old, a forensic accountant of exceptional ability, and she had spent the better part of 6 years at Whitmore Capital Group, making her brilliance completely invisible. She had mastered it the way other women mastered networking or negotiating raises. It was survival, dressed up as professionalism. Her desk occupied a corner of the compliance archives on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Bay Street. A windowless room lined with ledger drawers and server stacks that hummed their indifference 24 hours a day. She preferred it there. The archives did not have opinions about her weight. The servers did not track whether her blazer concealed the full breadth of her shoulders or whether her skirt fell past the knee. Numbers made no comment on the size of the body working to interpret them. They simply told the truth, and the truth, Verity had found, was the only territory where she was always safe. She dressed accordingly. Dark, oversized blazers, 2 sizes too large and deliberately shapeless. Heavy-framed glasses that sat too wide for her face, obscuring the striking symmetry of her dark eyes behind thick lenses. Her hair was the color of autumn chestnuts, and she wore it in a tight bun so severe it looked almost punitive. Nobody on the 14th floor of Whitmore Capital Group knew that beneath those carefully assembled layers of concealment was a woman whose face held the classical symmetry of a portrait and whose mind could dismantle a 10-year financial deception in the time it took her colleagues to refresh their coffee. They called her V, not because they knew her well enough to use it as an affectionate shortening, but because the effort of learning someone's full name implied they mattered. On the morning everything changed, Verity was working through the Q4 ledgers for a set of private investment accounts managed by Whitmore's most powerful and most feared client. She had been given the task because Deirdre Callister, a senior director with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and a talent for delegating exclusively to people she considered beneath her, had dropped the binders on Verity's desk on her way to a lunch she had already expensed to the firm. "These need to be cross-referenced and summarized before 3, Deirdre said, barely glancing at her. "And try not to take all afternoon. Some of us actually have client-facing responsibilities." Verity said nothing. She pulled the binders toward her and opened the first one. 3 pages in, she went very still. The accounts belonged to Gideon Sark. This fact alone would have been enough to make most people on Bay Street nervous. Gideon Sark was not the sort of name that appeared in the Financial Post alongside charitable donations and golf tournament sponsorships. He was the sort of name that circulated in the spaces between legitimate business and its more profitable shadow. A figure of enormous, carefully cultivated authority whose real nature was understood by exactly the people who needed to understand it. He moved capital. He resolved disputes. He collected debts that conventional institutions would not touch. His reach extended from Toronto to Zurich to Hong Kong through a constellation of holding companies so elaborate that most forensic accountants would need 3 months and a team of 6 to begin untangling them. Verity had untangled them in 4 days. She had not been asked to. She had done it because the numbers made her curious, and curiosity was the one appetite she had never learned to suppress. And now, looking at the Q4 ledgers, she was staring at a problem. Roland Hess, the senior partner who managed the Sark portfolio directly, was skimming. It was elegant work. She would give him that. The amounts were small enough to avoid algorithmic flags, routed through a consulting entity registered under the name of a numbered Ontario company, whose directors existed only on paper. But the pattern was unmistakable once you knew how to look for it. Verity had been looking for exactly this kind of pattern since she was 23, and she recognized it the way other people recognized faces. Someone was stealing from Gideon Sark. She was still working through the arithmetic when the atmosphere of the office changed. It happened the way pressure changes before a storm, not through any single event, but through a collective, instinctive stillness. Phones were set down, conversations were abandoned mid-sentence. Verity looked up through the glass partition separating the archives from the open floor and saw the reason. Gideon Sark had come personally. He crossed the office floor the way certain men crossed rooms, as though the space had been arranged for his convenience, and everyone in it was acutely aware of that fact. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a charcoal suit with the understated precision of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything through clothing. His face was sharp and composed, a study in controlled intelligence, the kind that had not been softened by any expectation that he should ever be approachable. Beside him, a broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket named Corvin moved with the silent economy of someone accustomed to being the last line between his employer and the rest of the world. The boardroom doors closed behind them. Roland Hess emerged from his office 9 seconds later, visibly sweating. Verity. He appeared in the archive doorway, tie already loosened. His voice was trying to sound casual and failing entirely. Grab the Sark Q4 summaries and take them up to the boardroom. He wants them now. Verity looked at him steadily. That's typically your responsibility, Mr. Hess. I'm preparing the full portfolio overview, your archival. His voice dropped into something sharper, the desperation beneath it cutting through the professional surface. You're discreet, you're quiet. He won't even notice you walked in. Just put the files on the table and come straight back. She understood, in the precise and complete way she understood most things, exactly what he meant. She was being used as a delivery mechanism because she was considered unnoticeable. Because the people who ran this office had spent 6 years confirming to themselves that a woman who looked like her would register as furniture in a room full of expensive suits. Her mother's voice came to her then, quiet and tired and constant. The voice of a woman who had worked night shifts at a care home in Scarborough for 30 years, while her daughter earned a degree on scholarship money, and sheer stubbornness. The medical bills fanned across the kitchen table. The polite refusals from every other accounting firm where Verity had interviewed before Whitmore took her because her test scores were too extraordinary to ignore. She could not lose this job. She stood, gathered the files, and walked out of the archives. The boardroom smelled of expensive wood and recycled air. Verity kept her eyes on the table's surface as she crossed to it, moving with the quiet precision she had perfected, the particular gait of someone who had learned to take up as little room as possible, to make no sound, to complete the transaction of her own presence in the space of other people's attention spans. She set the files on the table. The Q4 summaries for the Sark portfolio. Her voice was steady. She turned to leave. Stop. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of certain fundamental forces, gravity perhaps, or the moment before a decision that cannot be reversed. Verity stopped. Turn around. She turned. She kept her gaze at a neutral point somewhere between the table and the far window, practicing the particular form of non-eye contact she had spent years refining. Gideon Sark was watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not hostility, not the mild, dismissive impatience she had expected. Something more considered than either of those things. Your name, he said. Verity Ashdown. I work in the compliance archives. An archivist. He said it the way someone might note the solution to a problem they had been working on for some time. Tell me something, Verity, from the archives. Roland Hess manages my accounts personally. Why did he send you? She could have constructed a professional evasion. She was capable of it. but standing in front of Gideon Sark felt like standing in front of a very precise instrument designed to detect exactly that kind of thing, and she had a working theory that lies told to dangerous men created the kind of compound interest that was very difficult to pay off later. "Because he is frightened of you," she said, "and because he assumed that due to my appearance I would go unnoticed. He believed you wouldn't pay attention to me." Corvin made a small sound from the corner. Gideon silenced it with a glance that did not require him to look away from her. He stood and moved around the table with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than urgency. He was taller than she had registered from across the room, which forced her to adjust her eyeline upward when he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the precise quality of attention he was directing at her. He looked at her the way no one in that building ever had, not through her, not past her, at her, with the complete focus of someone who had identified something the rest of the room had failed to see, and found that failure genuinely baffling. "Hess," he said finally, "is a fool." His voice was measured and low. "Only a blind man would fail to notice you in a room, Verity." The words landed somewhere undefended in her chest, and she had no immediate response for them. Gideon placed one hand on the files she had delivered. "Since you have intimate knowledge of this portfolio, and I suspect you do, because the archivist Hess sends to deliver files wouldn't look like that unless she had already read them. Tell me something. Is there anything in these summaries that should concern me?" Verity looked at the files, then at him. She thought about the two exits available to her, the door and the truth. The door had the merit of being immediate. The truth had the merit of being the truth, and she had spent most of her professional life in its company. "Page 73, she said. Her voice was clear and did not waver. "The consulting fees attributed to Northland Advisory Services. That entity has no operating history, no physical address, and no employees. It exists solely as a recipient. Over the past 14 months, $840,000 has been routed through it in amounts structured specifically to avoid the $10,000 reporting threshold." She paused. "Roland Hess is the only person in this firm with signature authority over those transactions." The room was very quiet. Gideon did not look at the files. He looked at her with something that had sharpened from consideration into a kind of precise, intent recognition. "How long have you known?" "I confirmed it this morning. I have suspected it for 6 weeks." A slow exhale, then with a deliberateness that felt like the drawing of a line on a map. "You are not going back to the archives, Verity." Within 48 hours, the compliance archives on the 14th floor had someone else's coffee mug on the corner desk, and Verity was sitting in an office adjacent to the private suite of rooms that Gideon Sark maintained in a renovated heritage building on Wellington Street. High ceilings, original brickwork, windows that looked out over the old city toward the harbor. The desk was mahogany. The chair was correct for her height. The view was of a city that had never once asked whether she deserved to be in it. For 2 days, she sat in it like a person waiting for the ground to prove it was solid. Gideon had handed her the complete financial architecture of his organization, the legitimate holdings in commercial real estate and private infrastructure across southern Ontario, the layered corporate entities that structured his other interests, with the calmness of someone passing a colleague a relevant document. His lieutenants, Corvin and a second man whose neutrality bordered on hostility, said nothing to her face and made no effort to make her feel welcome. But she was there, and for the first time in 6 years, her mind was not being rationed. On her 3rd morning, Gideon walked into her office, stopped in the doorway, and looked at her for a long moment. She was wearing the same category of camouflage she had always worn, shapeless, defensive, chosen for its capacity to make her smaller than she was. "You're still hiding," he said. "I'm dressed for a professional environment." "You're dressed to disappear." He moved to the center of the room, and studied her with the same quality of attention he had directed at her in the boardroom. Complete, undisguised, unbothered by her discomfort. The woman who identified a 14-month embezzlement scheme in a single morning does not hide. Not in my building. He picked up the desk phone and spoke a single name into it. 20 minutes later, a woman named Françoise arrived with 2 assistants and a rolling rack of clothing. Françoise dressed the partners of federal cabinet ministers and the women who ran the country's largest pension funds. She had the manner of someone who had seen every variety of self-concealment a woman could construct around herself, and found most of it unnecessary. Gideon stood behind Verity's chair. "Dress her properly," he said. "She is the chief financial strategist of this organization, and she is going to look like it. Don't conceal her. Dress her as she is." Françoise looked at Verity with a practiced, careful eye and nodded once. What followed was 3 hours Verity could not have predicted. There were no shapeless blazers, no strategic draping, no suggestions of what she might consider wearing if she lost any amount of weight. Françoise brought structured jackets with nipped waists, silk blouses cut to celebrate the full shape of her bust, tailored trousers that moved with the curve of her hips, with the easy authority of clothes that had been made to fit a body, not to resist one. The heavy-framed glasses were replaced with delicate gold wire frames that sat properly on her face and left her dark eyes fully visible, sharp and expressive as she had always been careful to conceal. When Françoise released her hair from its punitive bun and let it fall in rich, dark auburn waves past her shoulders, Verity experienced the peculiar sensation of seeing herself properly for the first time in years. She was still the exact size she had always been. The mirror confirmed this without apology. But the woman looking back at her was not hiding. She was still herself, fully, entirely herself, but she no longer looked like someone apologizing for it. Gideon stepped into the room. He stopped. The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. "There she is," he said quietly. That evening he took her to a meeting, not to observe, to work. The other party was a man named Piotr Haas, the head of a competing operation that moved money through the port logistics network from Hamilton to Halifax, who had arrived with a stack of falsified operational reports claiming his network was carrying significant losses and that an adjustment to their standing arrangement was long overdue. Haas looked at Verity across the table with the expression she recognized immediately, the brief, comprehensive dismissal of a man who had already decided she was decor. She let him finish his presentation, then she reached across the table and pulled his reports toward her. She worked through them for 2 minutes. Haas used the time to speak to Gideon as though she were not present. Gideon did not respond, and Haas, after a moment, began to find this unsettling. "Mr. Haas," Verity said. She had not raised her voice. She did not need to. "Your reported operational loss of $4.3 million in the second half of the fiscal year does not account for the accelerated depreciation you applied to your harbor equipment under the CCA Class 43 election, which you applied twice against the same asset pool. The loss doesn't exist. You've overstated your deficit by approximately $3,200,000. She set the papers down. "You owe Mr. Sark money, not the other way around." Piotr Haas stared at her. Gideon leaned back in his chair and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The expression on his face was the closest thing to uncomplicated pride Verity had ever seen directed at her by someone who stood to gain nothing from manufacturing it. She slept 4 hours and was back at her desk before dawn. She had been working through an internal trust structure for 2 hours when she found it. It was subtle, designed to be. The withdrawals were small, spaced irregularly, routed through a sequence of intermediary accounts with no obvious connection to one another. The kind of structure a person built when they had both the technical knowledge and the confidence that no one was looking closely enough to see it. Verity was always looking closely enough. She traced the withdrawals to a single originating account, requiring executive-level authorization codes. The codes on record were Gideon's. The timing patterns and the operational logic belonged to someone else. She cross-referenced the access logs, matched the IP signatures, and spent 20 minutes confirming what she already knew. Redmond Graff, Gideon's head of private operations, had been quietly moving money out of the organization for 11 months. Not to a personal account, she would have found that faster. To a holding company with indirect ties to Piotr Haas. Redmond Graff was selling Gideon Sark to his own competitor. She was still at her desk when the office door opened and Gideon walked in. He looked tired in the way powerful men sometimes look tired, not depleted, but temporarily surfaced from very deep water. His jacket was gone, his collar open. He moved behind her chair and set his hands on her shoulders, a steady and grounding pressure. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. "Redmond Graff," she said. 11 months. Just under 2 million routed to a shell company with traceable ties to Haas's network. He has been feeding your operational intelligence to the competition. She felt the hands on her shoulders go absolutely still. "Are you certain?" "The routing numbers are in front of you." He leaned forward to look at the screen, and for a moment they were very close, his face beside hers, the warmth of his presence against her back. She was acutely and entirely aware of it. "You are a remarkable woman, Verity Ashdown," he said, not loudly, not for effect, in the way someone speaks when they are simply saying something true. She kept her eyes on the screen. "I'm doing my job." "No." He turned to look at her directly, and the quality of it, steady, unambiguous, with none of the layered performance she had come to expect from men who said things they did not mean, made it difficult to look away. "You are doing something the people I employed before you were not capable of doing. Stop confusing those two things." The unencrypted phone on his desk rang. The rest happened quickly. The call, the news that Redmond had known he was close to being discovered and had moved. A private terminal at Billy Bishop Airport, a charter flight already booked, and a set of authentication tokens that, if connected to the main financial system, would authorize a transfer of the entire liquid reserve of Gideon's organization to accounts in Haas's network by morning. 40 minutes later, Verity was in the back of an armored Suburban moving south on the Gardiner Expressway with a laptop balanced on her knees, writing code against a timer in her head. "How long?" Gideon said. 11 minutes until he can complete the authentication. After that, the transfer takes 40 seconds. The vehicle accelerated through a gap in traffic that she chose not to look at. She did not have the system access to block Redmond directly. What she had was a detailed knowledge of the internal routing architecture, every corridor of it, every technical specification, because she had studied it the way she studied everything, completely, without shortcuts. She could not stop the transfer from initiating, but she could redirect it. She could build a recursive verification loop into the destination routing codes, something that would trigger a fraud flag from the receiving institution's own compliance system and freeze all associated accounts while the dispute was reviewed. It would look like a technical error. It would hold everything in place for 72 hours, long enough. She was at 89% completion when the Suburban hit the airport perimeter and stopped being gentle about it. Outside, she could hear it, the organized chaos of a situation being resolved the way Gideon resolved situations. She kept her eyes on the screen and kept typing. Someone hit the passenger window with something metal, and she did not flinch. She had made a decision somewhere between the Gardiner and the airport that she was not going to flinch anymore, and she intended to honor it. The progress bar reached 100%. She deployed the loop. The screen flashed red, requested biometric authorization from a senior account signatory, and she ran the voice code file she had retained from a corporate filing Gideon had made 4 months ago, kept, she had told herself at the time, for completeness. System accepted. Rerouting confirmed. On the tarmac, Redmond Graff looked at his screen and saw a fatal transfer error where his triumph had been. He was still staring at it when Gideon reached him. She did not ask what happened out there. She did not need the details. What she knew was this: she had just prevented the complete financial destruction of an empire that should not have been hers to protect. And she had done it in a parked car in the rain at Billy Bishop Airport while wearing a silk blouse, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, exactly the size she actually was. Gideon called her from the tarmac. "Is it done?" 72-hour hold across all associated accounts, she said. He didn't get a cent. A brief silence, then, "Wait for me. I'm coming to get you." 3 days later, the principals of the 4 networks that constituted the organized financial infrastructure of southern Ontario convened in a private dining room at a Yorkville hotel. They gathered because Piotr Haas had called the meeting, and Piotr Haas had called the meeting because he believed the events of the previous 72 hours had left Gideon Sark in a position worth exploiting. He was not a stupid man. He had simply made the mistake of not accounting for her. Verity walked into that room in a deep burgundy dress that her body filled without apology, her dark auburn hair loose past her shoulders, the gold wire frames catching the low light from the chandeliers above. She walked in on Gideon's arm, which was a statement in itself, and she felt the quality of attention shift in the room, the way she had once felt it shift on Bay Street. The same collective recalibration, the same reaching for a category that would make sense of what they were seeing. Piotr Haas managed a thin smile. "I wasn't aware this was going to be a social occasion." "It isn't," Gideon said. He pulled out a chair and waited for Verity to be seated. Then he stood behind it, both hands resting on its back, and the geometry of the arrangement said everything that needed to be said about where the authority in that room actually lived. "Mr. Haas." Verity opened the leather folder in front of her without looking away from him. "You called this meeting on the assumption that the attempted transfer 3 nights ago left Mr. Sark's organization financially exposed. You were counting on Redmond Graff having completed the authentication before we intervened." Haas kept his expression measured. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I know." She slid a single page across the polished oak table. "What I'm referring to is the recursive verification protocol I initiated while the transfer was in progress. It triggered a compliance review from the receiving institution, a review that traced the destination accounts backward through their routing chain, back to Cayman holding companies, back to Delaware shells, back to you." She turned the next page. "While your access to those accounts was briefly active and traceable, I conducted a secondary audit of your complete financial holdings, the ones that don't appear in any corporate registry. I have 14 months of transaction records, the complete ledger of your operational accounts in 3 jurisdictions, and documentation of every agreement you have made with parties in this room that you did not disclose to the others." She paused and let the silence settle. "As a courtesy, I will not be distributing this material today. What I will tell you is that you have 48 hours to withdraw your claim on the Hamilton Port contracts, transfer the outstanding balance owed to this organization, which my calculations put at 2.7 million, compounded, and submit a written dissolution of your current operation to the parties present. After that, you are free to go wherever you like." The silence that followed had a different quality from any silence Verity had experienced in a room full of powerful people. It was the silence of men recalculating their assumptions about where the power in a room actually was. Haas stood. She could see him weigh something behind his eyes, and then she saw Corvin and 2 other men adjust their positions at the perimeter of the room, and Haas weighed it again and sat back down. 48 hours, he said. His voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely. "The clock started when I walked in," Verity said. Later in the car, with the city passing outside in its ordinary and indifferent brightness, Gideon reached across and covered her hand with his. He did not fill the silence immediately. He did not need to fill silences, which she had come to understand was one of the few things she had ever genuinely admired in a person. "You were extraordinary in there," he said finally. She looked out at the lake glittering at the foot of the city. She thought about 6 years of archive rooms and deliberate invisibility, about the bun and the wrong-sized glasses, and the years of making herself navigable for people who had no interest in what she actually was. She thought about her mother, who had worked nights so that her daughter could work days in buildings, exactly like the ones they were now passing, and who would receive a phone call tomorrow morning, a call that would make every one of those years make sense. "I was myself," Verity said, "that's all." Gideon turned his head and looked at her, the full, unhurried look that she had stopped trying to interpret and simply accepted, the way you accept certain facts about the world once you have confirmed them enough times to trust them. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She had spent 6 years building an architecture of invisibility so comprehensive that she had nearly forgotten it was a construction and not a fact. She had mistaken her own camouflage for her own skin. The woman in the archive room, the one who asked for nothing, endured everything, and made herself small enough to be left alone, was gone. What remained was Verity Ashdown, sitting in the back of a car moving through a city that had once looked right through her, watching the harbor lights come on one by one across the dark water, and feeling with a quiet and absolute certainty that she would never again apologize for taking up exactly as much space as she deserved.